Welcome back, everyone. Another episode of Coffee with the Commish, continuing our run through all 30 Major League Baseball teams before we get to opening day on March 30th. This video, we're taking a look at the Miami Marlins. Over under 76.5 wins. Very, very long odds to win the division, even longer odds to win the pennant, and pretty much impossible odds to win the World Series. Coming on to talk about this very interesting team, bringing back Gio. He's been with us for the rest of the NL East. Only seems right to have him continue talking about this division with us. Welcome back. Appreciate you joining.
What's up, Commish? I'm actually talking tonight out of the beautiful state of Florida. So I find myself in Florida talking about Miami. So that's going to be pretty fun.
I love this. I love every time you show up. It's always going to be a different background because I know you travel a lot for work, and I know you're fitting this in with some of the other stuff that you have going on. So appreciate you making the time. Appreciate you calling us from the hotel and wherever you're at and delivering some high quality information for us.
Yeah, maybe I'll come up with some kind of like baseball question or baseball factoid at the beginning of each show where people can kind of guess where the fuck I'm at. But,
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about a Miami team that has plagued my two teams actually that I grew up with, the Guardians in 97, beating them, and then beating the Yankees in 2003. So the Marlins have a special kind of connection to my fan base and my heart.
Well, I love to hear that they beat the Yankees. As someone who is a Cleveland fan, I don't love to reminisce about us blowing that World Series, but it's a good time to jump into the history of this Marlins franchise. Other than those two World Series wins, there hasn't been a whole lot to write home about with this team. They won the World Series in 97, as you mentioned. They beat Cleveland, and then in 2003, winning another World Series. The only other playoff appearance that they've had in this entire span since the inception of the team was during this shortened COVID season when they went 31-29, and more than half the league made the playoffs that season. And even then, they lost in the division series 3-0. So Don Mattingly, he's been here now since 2016. You can see the start of his era there. Hasn't gone very swimmingly for him. You can look at the overall record in that span. They're 443 and 587. You put it another way, they're averaging about 70 wins per 162 games that they've played. Tough to put it all on Mattingly, though, because in that span, we go and we can look at the payroll. And what have they done? They've been going backwards now, 26th, 27th, 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 26th, 20th, and 28th in payroll, while Mattingly has been the manager as part of the Marlins organization. So give me the state of the affairs with the Marlins before we get into this player-by-player analysis. There's been a lot of guys that have gone out the door in the old regime when they got rid of Beckett, Miggy, Sheffield, all of those guys, and then more so as of late with JT Realmuto, Stanton, Yelich, Marcelo Ozuna. Give me the rundown on the front office, the payroll, and how you view the decision-making with this organization.
Sure. Well, for first off, let's bring that spreadsheet back up because there's some key things there that I want to highlight for everybody. One, I'm so glad Don Mattingly is no longer associated with this franchise. I feel like, they have their new boy out there, Skip Schumacher. He was a player for that St. Louis Cardinals teams in those mid 2000s. Played with like Albert Pujols. Played under Tony La Russa. Was a bench coach. Okay, like we'll see how it plays out. I don't think that's anything really special to write home about for Miami. I'm just glad Don Mattingly can now go to a different franchise, and I think he's taking a break in baseball, and good for him because he's deserved it. And he's been nothing.
His talents have been wasted away in Miami. The guy he had a reputation as one of the best managers in baseball before he went there, and the Marlins eviscerated it.
Yeah, nothing but class, I think, comes out of Don Mattingly. So I'm glad that he can kind of step away from this franchise and go somewhere else and resurrect that. When you talk about Miami, I think what's really important on this spreadsheet is those attendance numbers. Look at where the attendance was when you were about 2012 onward, right? So 2012, you have 2.2 million people who are coming to the ballpark. It takes a dip, 1.5, then it's 1.7, 1.7, 1.7, 1.5. But then look at where that drop-off happens, 2017 to 2018. Coincidentally, what happens, Nick? What happens, Commish, during that time period?
I mean,
what happened in 2018 for all Miami fans?
You get rid of your franchise cornerstone. You go from a 77-win team that was seemingly on the rise, or at least on the verge of potentially making the postseason, to a team that wins 63 games and is closer to a number one pick than you are playing in October.
You went from being second in the division, granted it was a bad division in 2017, and having a guy like Giancarlo Stanton, having guys like JT Realmuto, having guys like Christian Yelich, Marcell Ozuna, and sure, you're second place with a 77 and 85 record, right? But the fans were there. And then you trade those guys away, and then you immediately become the worst in the division. Kim Ng, the new general manager at this club, is not fixing a ball club. She's fixing a destroyed culture when it comes to Miami baseball. And this isn't new, right? I mean, I grew up with Florida Marlins teams when I was a kid, of Miggy, of Hanley Ramirez, of Josh Beckett,
Jose Reyes.
Exciting players. And the Marlins were always talked about going into baseball seasons as a fun young team. And I mean, Jesus, I'm even going back to guys like Dan Ugla. I don't know if you remember him, but it's tragic. And this team now is like, it's not like Houston or Chicago, where the fan bases are going to be there no matter what happens to the teams. Therefore, blow it up for 3 years. We trust the process and get us a good team in the future. Kim Ng's got to turn around a baseball culture in Miami, which I thought would be impossible considering the Hispanic community that's there, the Cuban population that's there, and ingrained in their culture is a love of baseball. And if you would tell me that of all the markets in Major League Baseball, Miami would struggle to have a culture, I would laugh in your face. But now I totally see it, right? So I feel like that's really the tallest order. The ownership group came in that bought Miami. I think that they're snake bitten a little bit. Bruce Sherman's lost money actually from their initial bid to buy the team and what the team is now currently valued at. I think it's them in Kansas City that kind of sits in that current situation. This is truly unique, and it doesn't help them that 3 major teams in their division in Philadelphia, Atlanta, and New York are going in the complete opposite direction. It's not, how sometimes in baseball it's like, okay, my team sucks, but so does the rest of our division. They're ergo, like, this season's kind of a wash, and hopefully we can maybe make a playoff run. That's kind of how the AL Central's felt maybe for the last couple of years. That's not the case anymore. Now it's like we are in a division where there's no hope, period. Because how do we compete? Like, there's no way to compete. So I look at some of the Marlins teams and I'm excited to talk about them individually, but I'm also skeptical that, any kind of winning culture is set in their future.
It's an interesting point that you bring up about the culture. And I think another word that can be used along a similar vein of culture is identity. And if I asked you, what does it mean to be a Yankee fan? What does it mean to be a Red Sox fan? What does it mean to be a Guardians fan, et cetera, et cetera? Most of the teams in Major League Baseball, most of the teams in most professional sports, there's a character, right? There's the blue collar, tough working community of some teams. There's the Yankee culture where it's championship or bust every season, the rabidness that's associated with that. Buffalo with the tailgating, the rabid fan base in the NFL. In Miami, there isn't any way to be a Marlin, right? There's no touching a sign as you're coming out of the clubhouse that says, thank God the Lord made me a Yankee or anything like that. There is no identity with that. And when you mentioned the Braves and you mentioned the Phillies, and in the other videos we talked about, they have guys locked up there for a decade. And what's nice about that is, 1, the consistency, 2, the elite talent that comes with locking someone up for that long. But 3, there's a certain aura that is built when you have Bryce Harper and Trey Turner there for a decade. There's a certain aura when that the guys that you're taking the field with in 2023 will be there in 24, 25, 26, 27. When you look at the Braves with Sean Murphy, Matt Olson, Ozzie Albies, Vaughn Grisham, Austin Riley, Michael Harris, Ronald Acuna. And then we look at the Marlins here. Sandy Alcantara has a 5-year deal that is one of the craziest contracts in the history of baseball, considering what Alcantara has ascended into the last 2 seasons, last year ultimately winning the Cy Young. But then you look at the rest of this roster. Avisail Garcia just got here last year. Soler, same thing, just got here last year. Barnes just signed a new deal. Gene Segura just signed a new deal. The entire rest of this roster is on 1-year deals or rookie deals, arbitration type deals. There is no culture. There's no one guy that you go to the ballpark as a Miami Marlins fan and think, man, I grew up watching him. I'm glad he's still around. I'm so happy that I've seen this guy ascend into stardom. There isn't any of those type of guys.
And listen, I've said it in a past video. I'll bring it up again. What I like in teams is teams that are willing to spend on the players that they develop to keep them with the fan bases. That's my telltale sign if I like an owner or not. Not the owner who's going to go out and get just the best free agents, but are you willing to pay the guys that you developed? So you talk about the Yankees. Being a Yankee fan means being a Mark Teixeira and an Alex Rodriguez fan. Absolutely, right? But the guys that stick with you spend their career as Yankee players, right? So Derek Jeter sticks with Yankee fans to this day, right? Derek Jeter means Yankees. Don Mattingly means Yankees, right? Aaron Judge now means Yankees with signing him up to his full potential and his full contract, right? So like you link different there's a passing of the torch in baseball between the generations, right? So all the guys who were my age back in the mid 2000s, the Derek Jeter guys, who that's their bread and butter, that's who we grew up watching. Here you go, modern day Yankee fans. Here you go to the 12-year-old. Now it's Aaron Judge for you guys, right? And you keep moving the baton forward. And before Derek Jeter, it was Don Mattingly. Before Don Mattingly, it was Munson. Before Munson, that's when you get into the Mickey Mantles and the Joe DiMaggios. Each generation passes forward a new era of excellence. Who do you do that for Miami?
You don't. They get traded before they're able to do that. The one guy that you lock up long term, Giancarlo, you trade him.
Right. So and listen, Cleveland's got the same thing, right? The different generations of handing it over, and Miami doesn't have that, and the Phillies do, the Mets do, and so do the Braves. And I struggle to see a team like Miami develop that culture. So Kim Ng's got a very high order to convince people who live in this area to invest in a ball club where it's like, why? Because you've never invested into our fan base. Like you've never listened to what we've had to say. So then why should I go out, by the way, to a stadium that's not close to a lot of the major communities that are like home communities, like kids and families? It's not close to any of those communities. So it's a hike out to the stadium if you live in like the general metro Miami area. And you're expecting people to go out and pay to watch what? Mm-hmm. So I think that's what they really have to answer. And it's going to look ugly for Miami fans if they are going in this direction. It's going to look ugly for their fan base for a long time.
It's hard to disagree with you, especially you didn't even mention the fact that there was all the animosity from the community when they built the new stadium. There's a lot of friction with the Marlins for a lot of reasons. And then you have the nightlife, which is a very real alternative to going and watching baseball or other professional sports, which is a reality, right? In Cleveland, there's not
you have your sports.
There's no South Beach. There's sports. There's suffering when the sports are bad, and there's rejoicing when the sports are good. But the one thing, and I think we can start diving into these players individually. If there is hope to be a Miami Marlins fan, Sandy Alcantara wins the NL Cy Young last year, established himself as one of the true aces of aces in baseball, over 200 innings of work, routinely getting deep into games. One of the first pitchers that we've seen in a long time that can, when he went out there, it was a question of, will the bullpen even be needed today? He would flirt with complete games on a semi-regular basis. A lot of red in this Savant chart, which is particularly notable considering where a guy like Sandy Alcantara started his career as someone who didn't necessarily look like someone who would be at the top of the rotation. And we can look at his first couple of years in the league. I know the first 2 years were very limited sample sizes, but still very, very unsightly ERAs and peripherals. Same thing in 2018. 2019, we saw a little bit of improvement. We saw a little bit of the potential as a workhorse with almost 200 innings. 2020 was the COVID-shortened campaign, but still the peripherals suggested that he was much worse than his 3-point ERA suggested. 2021 took a step forward, but wasn't an ace. And then 2022, that 2.28 ERA with the peripheral sub 3, the guy really, he's here now. He's here. He's a guy that is a legitimate ace. He can be the number one guy in a rotation, not because there's no other talent, but because he has truly earned that. Tell me, what do you expect from Alcantara going into 2023? Do we see a repeat of what happened? He's currently plus 600 to win NL Cy Young. Any thoughts that you have on that as well?
Yeah, I believe Sandy Alcantara is the best thing to happen to Miami in a long time. The contract that they have them locked on is criminal, considering that Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer are both set to make $43 million, and you're getting Sandy Alcantara right now for a good $6 million for 2023, and at max, come 2027, you have him on a club option for $21 million. So, well done, Miami decided this contract. If I were Sandy, I would arguably fire my agent, but that's neither here or there. You saw a career high FIP for Sandy last season. You saw him get guys out on the ground to a clip of 53.4%. The innings pitched at 228 innings is just unreal. It harkens back to days of old where, pitchers, when you were an ace, truly meant that you were durable and that you would be day in, day out, be able to go 7 innings right before you would see a bullpen. So he
real quick on that, nobody even came close to it. Aaron Nola, another workhorse, only 205 innings.
Yeah,
that's a seismic gap between the number 1 innings eater and the number 2 innings eater in Major League Baseball.
Well, we don't see that in baseball anymore, right? I mean, teams really handle, and they should. By the way, I'm not saying that I'm not one of these old school guys like Jim Palmer went out and he pitched every single goddamn day and twice on Sunday. Like I'm not one of those guys. I'm just simply saying that we don't really see this durability, and I think it's good that teams are a little bit more cautious with their pitchers. I disagree sometimes with how they actually apply it in certain situations. But, Sandy saw his numbers increase across the board. We saw him change major things, right? So like in 2021, he threw his fastball 21.6% of the time. 2022, he bumps up to 25.2%. What that tells me is the velocity was always there. He got more confidence in the control of that pitch. So I bet you anything in his mind, it's like he knew that he had that 98 mile per hour fastball. He was just afraid of where he was going to put it or couldn't put it exactly where he wanted. Maybe it was a little bit of an out of control thing. Not the case in 2022, right? He jumps up that usage, batting average 235. He throws people off because his number 1 pitch is that changeup, right? So if you're batting against Sandy Alcantara, you're getting adjusted to a 98 to 102 mile per hour fastball in that range. And then you have to readjust to his number 1 pitch, which is a 91, 90, 92 mile per hour changeup with shitload of movement. He's of course going to be in the Cy Young conversation. Barring injuries, he'll be right up there again for Miami. He is on the most team-friendly deal possible. It's the perfect storm, though, again, for Miami to go out. There is no team in baseball right now that would look at this and be like, oh, yeah, I'm not trading my farm system for this guy. You can go out and get a farm system for Sandy Alcantara on this contract and with these numbers and at his age. So what it smacks of me to Kim Ng is, how do we turn around this ball club? And it might be a tragic thing that yet again, they might look at this guy and be like, well, all of our organization has been terrible at drafts and, picking offensive pieces. I think they've done pretty well on the pitching side, but, picking offensive pieces have not been there. So time to trade Sandy Alcantara to kind of get our vision into Miami, and you burn the fans again. So love Sandy, love what he did. I think he's going to have a great 2023 campaign. He'll be the highlight of Miami. Now, whether or not that just adds him to a future trading block, I think is likely. I would say 60-40 that he gets traded in 2 years.
I feel that's got to sting if you're a Marlins fan, but I don't think it's the craziest thing in the world. And I know we'll get into the rest of this rotation in a minute, but they're 6, 7, 8 deep with really top end pitching prospects. So it's not unreasonable to think that we see them flip a guy like Sandy or one of these other pieces, maybe flip a Luzardo or Garrett or Sixto Sanchez or Cabrera, one of these guys to go get some more offense that's more major league ready because, like you said, they've struggled to develop those prospects. My thought process on Sandy for 2023, specifically related to the Cy Young, not investing in him. I think he's got an incredibly high floor. This changeup is it's no hitter wants to see this changeup when they step into the batter's box. You can see last year, I mean, a 145 batting average, a 194 slugging percentage, 0 home runs, only 11 extra base hits total against this pitch all season. That alone makes him someone who has an incredibly high floor. He's got multiple other offerings that help him get through the order multiple times and get guys out in different ways. There's few guys in Major League Baseball that can induce weak contact on a regular basis, like Sandy Alcantara. The big thing for me that I would love to see from Sandy to become a guy who I would trust perennially to be in these Cy Young conversations, it's just a little bit more against left-handed batters. There were certain lineup constructions last year that did tend to give him fits. There were spots to attack the other team in a first 3 or first 5 situation against Sandy. You can see K percentage over 6% lower against left-handed batters than it was against righties. Walk percentage a little bit higher, suggesting that guys are having a little bit better at bats against him from the left side. Still unhittable, and this goes back a lot to that changeup that is really a pitch that can neutralize the bat to ball skills for left-handed batters. So still did a great job limiting base runners. A 310 FIP is far from a catastrophe when you look at a platoon split like this, but if he can figure out a way to miss more bats against left-handers, there's really nothing standing between this guy and sustained greatness for the next 5-7 years, especially when you look at his age and he's still only 27. Having 3 years before you get to the age of 30, if you're Sandy, it's tough to make the Hall of Fame in baseball. It's getting a little bit easier the last couple of years. The restrictions are getting a little bit less stringent, but this is a guy legitimately that we may not have seen the best of Sandy Alcantara yet, which is a scary thing for opposing hitters. It's also a situation where I don't think you're out of your mind. If you're the Miami Marlins, what can you get for a guy like this?
Yeah, no. And listen, I don't fault, by the way, I don't fault Kim Ng for that. Like, she's the one who's got a really tall order with a culture, but that's not her fault. I mean, if she's the GM and she's stepping into this team, then I'm looking at them. They're clearly too far away to win, right? So, and the owner is not willing to spend money. So,
Yeah,
I would say, what do? Well, we do what we know other contenders have done. We go to our major pieces that have really friendly contracts, and every team in the majors would salivate over this contract for Sandy Alcantara. You know who would probably salivate over the most would be maybe St. Louis, the team that ironically he came from, right? like I would see St. Louis would trade the entire farm system, which is a pretty goddamn great farm system, to get this guy back in their rotation, because that's their one issue really, is their starting rotation, right? So there are plenty of teams that would trade the entire house for this guy. And if you're Miami, you should do it. If you're going to fit the model of rebuild, which you have to now, right? Because like we said with the other 3 teams, they're just so stacked and they have the owners behind them and the cultures are behind them. All 3, right? All 3 have money. All 3 have great cultures. Then the only hope you have if you're Miami is to draft guys, develop them, get them young, and then be that scrappy young team that hope the Mets fall off a cliff with durability issues. You hope that Philly and all their aging superstars, same thing. And that's how you sneak into the playoffs, right? So love Sandy. I just think that, he's just showcasing himself for other teams.
Yeah, and it's a good point that you make. You look at the talent that's locked up long term for the Mets, the Phillies, and the Braves, and will the Marlins be able to contend before 2028? Probably not. So I think it makes for a very interesting conversation. But the one thing that is relatively certain is that Sandy will be dominating as long as he is in a Miami uniform, especially in that run suppressing environment. But let's move on to some guys that may be there for the long haul in Miami. Let's move over to Jesus Luzardo. Not a guy that the market's shown a lot of respect for in terms of making that next leap to be a Cy Young candidate, but he is a very interesting left-handed pitcher for this Marlins group, because he went from being at the top of everybody's baseball 100 prospects list back when he was in Oakland to being demoted in AAA, being a guy that literally couldn't survive in any role in the big leagues, whether as a starter or Oakland tried him in the bullpen for a little bit as well. Got demoted, came to Miami, was actually optioned to AAA after the trade. So even Miami in their decrepit state of their franchise, wasn't ready for Luzardo to take the major league mound, but then has seemed to figure some things out, had a pretty productive 2022, ends up now he's in the top 15 in K percentage among starting pitching. So where is Luzardo at in your mind? Are the changes that he made with his pitch mix sustainable? The health is obviously an issue. Just give me your thoughts on Luzardo going into the new season.
I like Luzardo a lot. They'll have to lock him up soon as well. Luzardo and AJ Puck were the two guys that you constantly heard about for years, going to be 1-2 in their rotation for Oakland. Now they both find themselves on Miami. I liked what Luzardo did. It was tragic. We didn't see what he could do for a full season, right? Because, he goes out, he misses June, he misses July, he comes back in August. And at the start of the season, he was killing it. Like, if you look at his March and April numbers, right? 20 innings pitched, 3.10 ERA. He was doing so great, and then he just goes straight to that injury, and we kind of see it fall off a cliff. I mean, he was at 2.33 FIP. He was getting guys to bat down to the ground. That slider, by the way, is just a dirty pitch. I mean, that's how he was getting guys out consistently, and it was so much fun to watch. So he's on my list of just electric guys who I'm going to be following in 2023. I don't think he has any hope for any kind of awards. I just want to see him get through a full season healthy, right? Because, again, that slider, he mainly pitches that against right-handed batters, right? And held right-handed batters to, let me see his splits. But, the overall batting average was 157, 53 strikeouts. So that pitch is just hitters see it and they shake in their boots. So I think he's got elite stuff. He's 25 years old, very encouraging for Miami fans. Like, I think if Miami has anything going for them, it's a surplus of young, serviceable arms coming through their system, almost like an embarrassment of riches. Like, if Baltimore had this young pitching staff coming in with the offensive pieces they've also developed, I'm already nervous about Baltimore as a Yankee fan, but my Lord, like, Miami's been able to do this pretty well. So I like Luzardo a lot, like that they were able to get him away from Oakland. I see him being in a Miami uniform for a long time. I don't see him going anywhere anytime soon, because I think you can, again, get better pieces for an Alcantara, and then you can kind of give the fan – if let's say Luzardo has like a really great season this year, you give the fans something like, hey, we're going to keep Jesus Luzardo here. We got Sixto Sanchez. We got all these younger guys. We're using Sandy to beef up the offense, get some MLB-ready players. I'm going to talk that into existence because I want to see Sandy, by the way, go play for a different team. But, it's I think future is bright for Luzardo. His numbers look pretty good.
Yeah, the obvious thing here, you mentioned the slider usage. The Marlins are an analytically driven team. That's one thing that has been undeniable the last couple of seasons. We just showed you Sandy Alcantara's adjustments to his pitch mix, elevating that changeup usage, regaining a little bit of trust in his fastball, finding an ability to command that pitch a little bit better. The secondaries as a primary approach for Luzardo worked last year. The slider, I know you already mentioned it, against righties specifically, 167 batting average, only 3 home runs and 5 doubles allowed in 93 plate appearances. You'll certainly take that, especially when you go back and you look at what happened to Luzardo the last couple of seasons. 2019, his debut season, nothing really to make here, only 12 innings pitched. 2020, underwhelmed relatively significantly. 2021 was when it really started to fall apart. Couldn't get anything going. ERA north of 6. The peripherals suggested that he was every bit as bad as the surface level numbers indicated. Last year, though, he found something. Still only 100 innings, which brings with it some workload concerns going into 2023 because we've never seen him throw substantial amount of innings in a season. This is a guy who's dealt with injuries in Oakland as well. So that stuff that he dealt with last year in Miami, not really anything new. It's been more of a continuation of what we've seen from him. So for me, 150-1, you can get him as high as 150-1 at PointsBet to win the Cy Young. Absolutely no value here, despite the fact that I agree with you. He's got some of the best pure stuff in all of baseball. And we still see what had scouts and player development staff salivating over him 3, 4, 5 years ago. But the workload won't be there. The fact that he probably won't be able to get deep into games on a consistent basis, that he won't be able to win games. I know that's an antiquated stat, but it definitely still works in your favor. If you can at least get to 14, 15 wins, by the end of the year. So I think Cy Young conversations, throw them out the window. That being said, DFS, fantasy, all of those realms, Jesus Luzardo is a guy that you should absolutely be targeting because when he's healthy, he will be productive for you, especially against the right lineup. Still struggled a little bit against righties, but his ability to get through the order multiple times, the ability to miss bats with a couple of different pitches, if he can ever figure out how to get out of fastball purgatory, this is a guy that truly has ace stuff. And I'm not saying he's ever going to be as good as Sandy Alcantara if you guys ever get to that point, but there are worse things for a Miami Marlins organization than having a guy like Luzardo followed up with an Edward Cabrera, hopefully a continuing to develop Braxton Garrett, the Yuri Perez's of the world, the Sixto Sanchez, if he can get healthy. So there's a lot of talent in this rotation. I think a consistent theme as we get through these guys is simply going to be, can we keep them healthy? And who are the 5 guys that we pick? Because I think they're all worthy of being considered as front end or mid rotation arms for the next decade.
And eventually you got to get those guys up. Like you can't just have them kill AA and triple. You can't win AA and AAA awards for these guys and like you just don't see major league at bats. Like they need to see major league talent and pitch against major league talent. So, and you also left Max Meyer off that list, by the way. So
I forget about him because he's going to miss all season with Tommy John. But yeah, that was a guy who was in the big leagues last season and was ready to be there.
But again, just embarrassment of riches. But quick note back to the beginning of this video. There is hope for this Miami team if somehow they can start fleecing some desperate teams that need to reload their farm system. And if they can get some MLB-ready players, like a St. Louis, for example, like there's some hope that they can go in and trade some of these key pieces if they pick the right guys to stay. We see Atlanta. They got 3 guys, Strider, Wright, and Fried. 3 guys, and then they can fill in those other 2 spots with serviceable starters, right? So you don't need 5 aces on your staff. You need 3, I would argue, you need 2 aces and 1 guy who's just above average, right? Or young guy. So they pick the right 3. All those guys can be sufficient trade pieces to go build this team into a contender. It's just, that's why I am excited for the new GM, excited for a new coach. Like they are kind of like cleaning house a little bit, but Jesus Luzardo, though, would be one of the guys that I would keep. I would say, okay, we're going to keep this guy because he might not be 1, but, one of the younger guys might be 1. He might be 2 or 3, and he's already young. We have him on good contract and all that kind of stuff. So I thought that was a very good signing. But you mentioned a guy who I know you're itching to talk about. It's Braxton Garrett. Maybe we can jump over to him. What's your start off with Braxton? The thing that stood out to me was he struggled a little bit more against righties than he did lefties. His FIP was 396 against righties, 249 against the lefties. That's not great. So what are you looking to get out of Garrett for him to make a permanent stay in this rotation?
I think Garrett's already done enough to prove that he belongs in the rotation. He's allegedly fighting for the 5th and final spot in the rotation with Trevor Rogers going into opening day. You mentioned embarrassment of riches. I think even for a team that's projected to win less than 81 games this season, I think that's just another indication of where this team is at because Alcantara is for sure going to be in the rotation for obvious reasons. Luzardo will be in the rotation. Edward Cabrera is going to be in the rotation. And then having guys like Johnny Cueto, who you brought in, and the other prospects with Sixto Sanchez, who's coming back after a lengthy absence, and Yuri Perez, some of the other prospects coming up. Braxton Garrett, I think, has done more than enough to prove that he belongs in a big league rotation. It's tough just because there's so many viable starting pitching options for Miami. But I really liked what he did last year. We're going to pull up a Savant chart. There's a lot more blue than I think is warranted when you really start to dig into what he did. I think he's a pitcher with a very, very high baseball IQ. He's a guy that's open to change. He's a guy that has bought into the new era of baseball, of analytics, of reshaping pitches, of making minor adjustments that pay major dividends. One thing that was really interesting last year, if you watch Braxton Garrett, and they mentioned it on the Marlins broadcast a few times, was he shifted his foot on the rubber more towards first base, which changed his arm slot a little bit more ended up paying pretty major dividends against him, helped him add a little bit of velocity. And one of the things that also transpired from an analytics perspective, which is almost always front office driven or baseball operations driven rather than player driven, is this change in pitch mix. And the fastball, you can see the declining usage now a couple years in a row. I wouldn't be surprised if he threw this even less. Similar to Luzardo, another left-handed pitcher on the staff, going with his secondary pitches as his primary offering with the slider over 30% of the time. And you can see why. The slider, very, very good pitch, 220 batting average against, 364 slugging percentage. Did a good job limiting hard contact. 40% whiff rate is filthy. That's stuff that's very difficult to teach, even with all of the robust technology that we have nowadays with the precision cameras that we have that can help with pitch grip and all of that. He has tools to be a very, very good middle of the rotation starter. I think there's even potential for him to one day be at the top of a rotation, or at least in that co-ace type of conversation, how we think of a guy like Zach Wheeler. So I think there's a lot to like here. It's a matter of what can we do to continue to make him better. And the splits that you mentioned, I think is one thing that the Marlins are certainly looking at. A 396 FIP is not terrible by any means, but when you look at the walks plus hits per inning pitched, when you're allowing a base runner and a half roughly per inning against lineups that stack righties 7, 8, or 9 deep, this becomes problematic for him. You can see that this is a real thing. So when you're looking at splits data, sometimes FIP will be a little bit of a misnomer. It might not be a true indication of how good or bad a guy has been against one side of the platoon split. But when you see a K percentage 6% lower, when you see the opponent batting average about 100 points higher, this all makes sense. He's much, much more effective against lefties. He needs to figure out how to get righties out on a more consistent basis. And when you go back to his pitch repertoire, it could be a situation where there's a little bit more that we can get out of this changeup, a pitch that we've seen other organizations around the league increase that usage to help offset the platoon split. We've seen it even within the Marlins organization with a guy like Sandy Alcantara elevating that changeup to be his primary offering. So there's a lot to work with Garrett. I like him a lot. I hope they give him a shot on the opening day roster. There's talks of them using a 6-man rotation out of the gate, which would include both Garrett and Trevor Rogers. I don't think that would be a bad decision whatsoever because these guys deserve major league innings. And if you can help limit the workload of Luzardo and some of these other younger guys who have never thrown 175 or 200 innings, I think that's a win all the way around for the organization.
So we talked a little bit how in the Atlanta video, the pitchers feed off each other. So when you have like an established culture and there's not like this cutthroat, like if I get to the majors, you don't kind of attitude, right? It's like we're all here and we're all established. Therefore, we can start building relationships. You know who's got an elite slider on that team in Miami? Jesus Luzardo. You know who's got an elite sinker? Alcantara, right? But, you got Garrett struggling to get here into the rotation. He can't go to these guys and talk to them and try to really like pick their brains on where do they locate it? How do you throw it exactly? Where are you throwing it? All those conversations really can't happen because Braxton's sweating on the sidelines, wondering if he's even going to break the major league rotation, right? So, again, I think that's another problem that Miami has. You got some guys who've solidified their spots, but then you have others that are just constantly in this hound race to get to the majors, and they can't really settle in. But I do like Garrett. I think he's interesting. I like him in the same way I think I like a lot of these younger pitchers. It's just who's going to be on trading blocks and who's going to actually make their way into the rotation. But I think we're going to see some serious moves from Miami at the trade deadline. They got a lot of great pieces that teams would 100% go out and trade MLB ready talent for a Braxton Garrett. So let's stay on that note because you mentioned Trevor Rogers. We'll get back to Edward Cabrera and we'll get back to Johnny Cueto, but let's stay on Trevor Rogers real quick because he's a very interesting case. What's your thoughts on kind of like the fall of grace of Trevor Rogers? He had a pretty good season when you go back to 2021, right? And a lot of people were like, wow, like this is a guy who solidified himself in the rotation. Then he comes out in 2022 and kind of puts up a real stinker. Like it's just Jesus. Like, don't even know what to make of it because it's so drastically different than the campaign he had in 2021. So what do you think? Diagnose him for the people at home. What happened, and why now does he find himself struggling to get into rotation after he puts up a season of a 255 FIP, a 264 ERA, and pulling down 133 innings in 2021?
The thing with Trevor Rogers is pretty much everything he does is dependent on his changeup, which is what we've talked about with these last couple of pitchers, where their secondary offerings are actually a little bit counterintuitively more important than their fastball in a way. And when you look at his 2022, it was god awful in a lot of ways. And the expected stats, the expected batting average, the expected slugging, there's a lot of blue here, which is not encouraging. But he's still only 25 years old. And when you go back and look at 2021, this guy had red across the board on his Savant chart. There's literally nothing that happened last year for me that made me look at Trevor Rogers and think to myself, this guy could never regain the form that he had in 2021. A big thing that happened was just he wasn't able to locate his changeup the same way that he was in 2021. You can see it caught a lot more of the actual lower part of the strike zone, which is a more hittable pitch than being able to throw this effectively off of your fastball and get this ball to drop out of the strike zone to generate swings and misses. And when this so if you see a heat map like this, and if you see the drop off in Savant numbers here, one thing to investigate is the command. Where is he throwing that pitch? So look at the heat map. You can see that it's catching a good chunk of the zone here. And then if you go and you look at the whiff rates on this pitch, what you would expect to see is that his changeup was generating fewer swings and misses in 2022 than it was in 2021. And what you see is that's exactly the case. In 2021, this was one of the best pitches in baseball. Opponents batted 199 against it. Very few extra base hits, only the one home run. You can see it, a 265 slugging percentage against the pitch. Last year, the whiff percentage dropped by about 7%. Hitters had a lot better approach against that pitch, and part of that was just the fact that that pitch ended up in the strike zone more than it had the previous season. 2 home runs, not the end of the world, but a lot of extra base hits, 15 doubles in that span, 246 batting average against. It led to a lot of problems. You can see this is a pretty dramatic increase in ERA. It's a pretty dramatic increase in xERA and FIP, all things that support that he actually was pretty bad last year. The hard part with Trevor Rogers is a lot of what made him bad was just the amount of right-handed batters that he saw and not being able to get right-handed batters out. It's astounding to see a guy have a K percentage 10% lower against one side of the plate, to see his whip balloon from 1.19 to 161 against right-handed batters. The FIP going from 259 against lefties to almost 5 against righties. This is not something that we saw in 2021. We can go back here and we can look at his splits. He had success against both sides of the plate the year prior. And when you think about what is that pitch that he has to throw against righties on a consistent basis and be able to utilize well, of course the fastball, because it's his primary offering, but it's the changeup. That's the second pitch. That's the pitch where everything else for Trevor Rogers either thrives or fails. And last year, right-handed batters hitting 287 against the pitch with all of these extra base hits. It's not a surprise that guys got a lot better looks at him. Again, the encouraging thing is command is a correctable issue. And if we can get Trevor Rogers back to locating his changeup a little bit more and the fastball being a little bit better than it was in 22, because the fastball was terrible as well. But a lot of that happens in conjunction with what happened with the changeup, in my opinion, with him. So we'll see what happens with him. I think there's still high end potential with Trevor Rogers, a guy that looked like one of the better pitchers in the National League in 2021. It's an uphill battle for him.
Yeah, I think I was going to mention that fastball because looking at the Savant charts, it's bad. I mean, it went from a 352 slug in 2021 and it jumped all the way to 593. Clear, and then the 329 batting average against the pitch, and he only throws that about 94 miles per hour. And when you look at the heat map, he kind of serves it right on a silver platter for batters. He's another guy that I would not be shocked if he finds his name on the market. Teams looking at his stuff, thinking that they can kind of unlock it a little bit. Miami maybe gets a nice prospect on the offensive side. Wouldn't be shocked at all. Maybe a couple good starts out for Miami in a 6-man rotation kind of deal, just kind of showcase some of the young guys that they have. You'd like to think that teams are getting more analytical but then I read articles about the Washington Nationals, and then I don't like to give a lot of hope sometimes to certain ball clubs. So I'm wondering if there's just a team out there that would look at Rodgers and just be like, he's got the stuff, man. He's got that old school way about him. We need to get him here. You know what I mean? So,
but I think both ways. I think he has raw stuff that makes him appealing, but when you look at the pitch mix, he's one of the few guys in this Miami rotation that doesn't use the secondaries as primaries approach. I think there's arguments to be made that maybe we could see more of the slaughter, maybe we could see more of the changeup, or maybe there's a more optimal combination of usage here that can get Trevor Rogers to be much better against right-handed batters, and then consequently far more consistent going through the order multiple times, going from start to start. It's tough because when you think about guys who Miami might be willing to trade, what are you going to get for certain guys? Like Luzardo, I think, is a great case here of like elite stuff, but there's a reason that a team like Miami was able to get him for not a lot. And it's because the injury history is there. There's a lot of volatility of he could be really, really good. He could also be really, really bad. And we don't want to trade anything significant for him. Trevor Rogers, I think, fits a similar bill of we know what he did in 2021, but we also really, really know what he did in 2022. And that's a large range of potential outcomes that are all equally realistic in my mind, which then is an uncomfortable conversation for the Miami Marlins because you don't want to trade guys that have high end potential for nothing. But in a crowded rotation, you don't want to keep guys like Sixto Sanchez or Yuri Perez from gaining valuable big league innings because there's a log jam. That's not productive from an organizational standpoint as well. The one thing that is nice for the Marlins is a guy like Edward Cabrera came up last year and was as advertised, was very, very fun to watch. There some youth for sure, but throws the hardest changeup in all of baseball. He's struggled mightily with the fastball command, but I think mastered the harder part that a lot of pitchers, it takes a lot longer for them to get is how can you throw your secondary pitches for strikes or near strikes that induce swings and misses. What do you make of Cabrera? Because he's one of the four guys that are locked to make this rotation out of camp with Alcantara, with Cueto, with Luzardo, and then Cabrera. So what do you make of him coming off of a relatively impressive rookie campaign going into 2023?
A couple of numbers that concerned me from pitching. I mean, when we were in the Mets video, we talked about Senga, right, and how he was coming over Japan, and one of our main concerns was lack of control. And I brought up in the video that he was walking guys at an 11% rate, which is horrendous in Major League Baseball. And then I look at Cabrera, and he was 11.3%. Control issue, I think, is massive. Yeah, when you look at his splits against right-handed batters, I think he had a better strikeout rate, but he had a way worse walk rate. Doubled 7.3% walk percentage against lefties, but 14.9% against righties. So he's loading the bases, and he's got a 620 FIP against right-handed batters. So his control is the major issue, I think, if you're a Miami fan going into 2023. Like you said, his pitch mix is good. I think he's got some gnarly stuff. He's definitely got a bunch of pitches that he throws. He's got a changeup, curveball, four-seam slider, sinker, and he throws them all relatively a lot. So it's not like one of those things where he has like one pitch that he just throws it like 1 or 2% of the time. Like he likes to mix up the pitches, and I think that's great for a young guy. But his control is kind of all over the place. So if the Marlins have found a way to kind of fine-tune that and really focus on how are we going to lower it, I think you see some great things. I think his start of last season has merited for sure him starting in the rotation. But, if we're into end of April, mid-May, and those walk rates haven't gone anywhere and we find ourselves losing games because he's losing control, then we may have to give a shot to one of the other guys to come up here, and we can't really wait on Cabrera to kind of like figure it out, if that makes sense.
It's tough because there's so many good pitchers. So, I mean, the Marlins are in no rush. They're not winning the division. They're not winning the pennant. They're not winning the World Series. So from that perspective, they have all the time in the world for Edward Cabrera to figure it out, and they need him to build his workload. He only threw between, the four levels of the minor leagues that he pitched in 2022 through a little over 100 innings, was very effective at all of the levels. The issue primarily at the major league level being that walk rate, which it did surface at different points in the minor leagues as well. Some stuff like AAA, 14.7%. So it's a reason for concern, no doubt. But with a guy like Edward Cabrera, when you go and you look at what opponents did with the bat against these pitches, I mean, my God, for someone to have four different pitches to hold opposing hitters to a sub 200 batting average, for three of those pitches to hold opposing hitters to a sub 3 slugging percentage, that's the stuff that you talk about when you talk about an ace, when you talk about a guy that can get through the order multiple times, having multiple different ways to get guys out. Against lefties, you can see, because you mentioned the splits, and against lefties, he was fantastic. And when you look at how he was fantastic against lefties, a lot of it centers on that changeup, which is a neutralizing pitch for the opposite side of the plate. He's got a very, very nasty curveball that generated near a 40% whiff rate. So that's where a lot of the strikeouts are coming from. It's really the command, because even the fastball, guys don't really touch any of his stuff. As a Miami fan, this makes you very, very excited. The problem is when a guy has a likely innings cap in 2023 because he's never thrown 150 or 175 innings in a season, command becomes an issue, whether it's from a fantasy perspective or a DFS perspective. This is the kind of guy that goes out there and gets yanked in the fourth or fifth inning on a day where he's not very effective, because there's no reason to push him. You don't want a lot of high stress innings on a young arm, especially when the rest of this rotation has dealt with a lot of injuries. And a guy like Sixto Sanchez, who proved himself to be major league ready, but then got hurt and hasn't thrown a pitch since 2020. You don't want to relive that with any of these other top prospects that you have coming out of your system.
Yeah, I think what concerns me, though, is the new rules and the new offensive rules that come in play this year with a young guy who doesn't have a lot of control. We're going to see an uptick in stolen bases. We're going to see offensive upticks all over this game. So a walk rate in which over 10% is even more concerning to me going into 2023 than it has been in past years. So, we'll see. We'll see with him. I think he's earned the right on the rotation, but really, that 11 points, I can't get past that in my head for young guys. And this is not the year with all these new rule changes coming into play where it's like, oh yeah, he can get solid control over that. I think he's going to lose Miami a lot of games because of it.
Well, maybe all hope is not lost. Let's go talk about a guy that I know you're excited that the Marlins went out and got. Johnny Cueto could be a mentor figure for a lot of these young guys. He's been around the circuit a time or two, or maybe 20. What can a guy like Cueto bring to the clubhouse, to a Miami organization, which we've talked about lacking identity, lacking like a Marlin way, so to speak? Like we hear the Patriot way when guys go to New England in the NFL. We hear about the Yankee way. We hear about this kind of stuff. What can a guy like Johnny Cueto bring in terms of value at his advanced age, both from a functional standpoint as like a fantasy sleeper or a guy that you get later in drafts, but then also from a clubhouse perspective, from a mentor role with all of these young guys on the staff? How do you see Cueto fitting into the plans for the Marlins in 2023?
This is going to be a dark video, Commish. I apologize for the tone, but it's a rough team to talk about. I like Cueto as one of the key free agent signings. You get him for $6 million. That's a great deal, in my opinion, for a team that lacks identity. I'm going to quote Ethan Katz, who's the current pitching coach for Chicago. What he brings to the game is intensity, a passion, and a work ethic. He'd be great for younger guys, just having him around. And, Bruce Bochy as well. Bruce Bochy. He was the manager for San Francisco, won 3 World Series. He's the current Rangers head coach. Quote, he just keeps a calmness about him in traffic. And we saw it tonight. He just doesn't panic. So 2 major things that I get from those coaches. You bring in a guy like Johnny Cueto, to a young pitching staff who just has the work ethic, right? So Miami's a party city. You got a bunch of young guys in that town. They're not a great ball club, which just, it feeds maybe into a destructive cycle of guys who are like, yeah, we don't have to take baseball pretty seriously. We're going to lose anyway. I just got to go out and get mine. You have that situation that could brew in a poorly run clubhouse. I think Johnny Cueto was a great signing for them to kind of bring in a veteran who's seen World Series championships. He's been a part of those games. He's been a part of winning cultures, and you saw it maybe a little bit in Chicago. Like, I won't account for like some of the success of the young pitchers in Chicago to Johnny Cueto, but Johnny Cueto was effective for them. Pitched 158 innings for them last year in Chicago, so he's not done. Like he is not done pitching at the major league level. So I think they get a good guy, just as an innings eater, workhorse. He knows how to win, and for your young guys like a Braxton Garrett, like a Cabrera, like a Sixto Sanchez, just keeps them in a mindset of like they can watch what Cueto does. And I love the comment, by the way, by Bruce. The idea of keeping calm, right, is huge for young pitchers, especially like Cabrera, like we just talked about, having a walk rate about 11%, right, putting guys on base. It gets in a pitcher's head. I can't move out of this inning. I just can't get out of this. Can't get out of this slump. Even a guy like Alcantara, who's only 27 years old, learning from a guy from Cueto, right? Cueto's been known historically as just an Iceman on the mound. So you can impart some of that wisdom, impart some of that mentality. So great signing. It's the kind of veteran signings you want to see of contending ball clubs, like, young contenders, like in Atlanta would really serve from this. You got a lot of young guys. They're contending for World Series. You want to bring in veterans like this to provide that experience. So it puts Miami on the right track, and I don't think you get them at an incredibly expensive amount. So great signing. I love it for Miami. From a baseball perspective, in terms of performance, you don't get it doesn't change their season, in my opinion. It doesn't like swing the win total one way or the other because you get Johnny Cueto. It just feeds into what we said at the beginning of this conversation of we need to establish an identity, and guys like Cueto can help us do that.
I don't have much to add on that. Functionally speaking, he's not very exciting on the mound. He's definitely intriguing to watch. It's fun to see him mess with hitters' timing with a unique delivery. A little bit worse against left-handed batters, but he eats innings, as you said. He can get through the lineup multiple times. He can teach other guys how to get through the lineup multiple times. We talked in that Braves video again about guys on a pitching staff watching other pitchers throw their bullpens all season long, picking up things from them. Just being around a guy like Cueto for 162 games, for a month of spring training, for 187 or 190 days for the regular season, all of these young guys should benefit from that. Cueto is also a guy that probably you can trade in July for a mid-level prospect, assuming he's having a semi-decent season and he's healthy. So Miami might be able to get a little bit of a return there. It's hard to imagine the Marlins doing anything uber competitive with a guy like Cueto as arguably their second most reliable starter going into 2023. So I don't like it from that perspective, but yeah, I thought you did a good job summing it up. Could be a good mentor figure for less than $10 million. It could do worse.
Why not, right? No, good signing. Good job. High five. Good job. Good job, Miami. Well, why don't we diagnose the bullpen? So
yeah, let's go in there. I mean, the bullpen, logically, when you think about building a competitive team, a contending team, the bullpen is the last thing you invest in. Why? Because if you don't have a lot of late leads to protect, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spend a bunch of money on a bunch of high-end late inning relievers that frequently will be pitching in losing efforts. They did go get Matt Barnes. They have Dylan Floro, JT Chargois, Tanner Scott, AJ Puck, who we mentioned was a former top prospect with the Oakland Athletics. Anyone in your mind that is interesting going into 2023? Anyone that you think could make this bullpen more competitive than it looks on paper?
Puck. I think Puck was their best acquisition, and I think it was a long-term one and great trade because I'm going to pull up Puck's numbers now, so I have it actively right here in front of me, right? What you see from a guy like AJ Puck is just the mindset of we're not just going to have a Matt Barnes, sign an old school kind of, expensive guy to come in and fill in a role in our bullpen, or, sign a quick arm to throw into our bullpen just so someone has the ball after our slew of talented starters that we have coming out of our farm system. There's someone just to be there. Puck signifies to me as someone who they can invest in. 66 innings for Oakland. He had 3.12 ERA. I 3.69 FIP. He's what I would want. 28 years old. He was a highly touted prospect out of Oakland. Like I mentioned earlier, it was Luzardo and Puck every year for at least 2 years. I heard, these two guys are going to be the future of the Oakland franchise. So I thought that was a very smart decision to go ahead and get him into your organization, and it showed forward thinking on the part of the Marlins. The others, it's all kind of for me. I mean, they have the fourth best bullpen in the NL East. I think that's good, right? I mean, you can't be as bad as Washington. So
nobody can be as bad as Washington at literally anything on a baseball field or off of a baseball field. Anything related to producing quality substance of any kind, the Washington Nationals are surely the worst at that.
I feel like the Washington Nationals video, like I shouldn't even show up for that one. I should just let you.
No, it's just going to be a monologue about how poorly run that organization is, and then I'll just mention the player's name so that way you know who should be associated with the poorly run organization. The one signing that I did think was confusing, to put it nicely, this year was Matt Barnes with the Miami Marlins. The guy is clearly on a downhill trend for obvious reasons. One, he's getting up there in age. Two, he's had declining effectiveness over the years. Three, he's never really actually sustained any sort of elite production. And if we pull up his fan graphs here, it might surprise people to go look at Matt Barnes' end of the season numbers and see that he's actually never finished a season with an ERA sub 3. Because I know he's had stretches of seasons where he's been elite, where he's looked like one of the best late inning relievers in baseball. But let's go backwards: 4.3, 3.8, 4.3, 3.8, 3.7, 3.9, 4. Like, this guy's always had something problematic happen throughout the course of a season that has kept him from being a truly reliable relief ace on a contending team. And that's why time and time again we've seen Boston losing their mind at one point or another in the season and demoting him out of the ninth inning and using someone else in the more high leverage roles. Matt Barnes has a slew of issues associated with him that I think make this signing very, very odd, again, to put it nicely. Declining K percentage. I think one thing with him is the declining fastball velocity. And again, you can get this all in Savant. You can see at his peak about 97 miles an hour, but last season around 95. And this has been a steady decline over the years. And the pitch, frankly, is just getting a little bit more hittable. The whiff rate isn't there. 23.6% last year. When we go and we look at his splits, this is a problem for a guy that you supposedly want to put at the back end of your bullpen, to have a whip near 1.5 against both righties and lefties, against righties to have a K percentage below 16%, a double-digit walk rate against both righties and lefties. There's things that you can fix with some guys, analytically speaking. You look at the Tampa Bay Rays, I think, are far and away the best case study of this, where they can go out and find any guy that throws a reasonably hard fastball in the mid to upper 90s and a guy who has a semi-effective slider, and they will turn him into a productive reliever. Matt Barnes does not have those qualities. He has a fastball going in the wrong direction velocity-wise. He does not throw a slider, and there's a debate about how effective this curveball is and how effective that it's been over the last couple of seasons. So for him, like, there's not a lot to like. And then when you go look at the rest of this bullpen, Dylan Floro limits home runs. That's a positive thing that you can say about him. JT Chargois spent most of last year on the injured list with an oblique injury. We saw a spike in his ground ball rate with a little bit of an increase in his sinker usage. Tanner Scott keeps throwing his slider more, his fastball less. I think it's starting to get to a point where we'll just bring him up real quick before we get into the offense here. But this is where I think the Marlins are a little bit limited on talent, because you can do a lot to improve a guy's outlook or his trajectory by altering his pitch mix. And you can see Tanner Scott was still pretty effective in 2022. But when you keep throwing this slider more and more and more, but then you don't throw that fastball enough to warrant batters taking their their bat off the shoulder against it, they'll just end up sitting on this pitch. And you can see that teams are starting to get a little bit better look against that slider. 4 home runs against the pitch last year. All of this is to say the Miami Marlins have, I actually didn't have my screen shared for that, I just realized, but you can see pretty effective with the exit velocities and things like that. But the fact that he keeps throwing this slider more and more and more, there's a point of diminishing returns on this where hitters are eventually able to just sit on this pitch because they know it's going to be coming at such a high frequency. So it becomes less deceptive. It becomes less effective as a result. So all of this is to say you have an Atlanta bullpen that is clearly in a position where they expect to go try to win a World Series. The Mets are spending over $300 million. So of course they're going to go try to win a World Series, and they have Edwin Diaz and Adam Ottavino and some of those guys at the back end that give you that indication as a fan and as an analyst. And then you have the Philadelphia Phillies, who have gotten considerably better in the back end of their bullpen, in part because they have a manager that knows how to use their bullpen effectively, but investing in guys like Sir Anthony Dominguez, Jose Alvarado, going and bringing in a Craig Kimbrell to a bullpen that you had Matt Strahm there that you acquired already during the winter, that you have Connor Brogdon, that you have Nick Nelson, that you have some other guys. The Marlins are very, very, very clearly the 4th best bullpen in this division. And when you're thinking about intent to win, that's a big deal. So I know we're only about halfway through this video, but them to win the NL East, there is close to a 0% shot. There's absolutely no way that the Miami Marlins find a way to win this division, purely looking at their bullpen. And I say that with the utmost confidence in the world. And we mentioned some of the concerns in the rotation. We're about to dive into the lineup and some of their defensive inadequacies. This is not a team that there's a lot to like on the futures market this year.
No. And I think that sums it up pretty well. We can now move on to the offensive side of the ball. And it's going to get even darker from here. There's a couple of.
Where do you want to start? Which guy do you want to take a look at first? Because I think there's probably 2 guys that we can say positive things about, and then the other guys I think we'll be omitting some other stats if we're trying to spin this a little bit positively.
Okay, look, I think that there are 2 guys who you need to bring up in the. Why don't we do this? 2 guys in the negative, 2 guys in the positive. And I think you can guess who the 2 guys in the negative are in my mind. You want to take a shot after knowing me how I talk in these videos? Huh?
2 guys in the negative?
Yeah. Because you know
I think it'll be Jorge Soler, and I think it'll be Avisail Garcia, the 2 guys that
yes.
are actually the most expensive guys on in the lineup.
You mean number 1 and number 2 on the payroll? Yes. Those are the 2. So listen, we'll do negatives first, and then we'll end on a more positive note, because I think that there are three players that I think are positive to talk about for Miami. They get a Luis Arias, good enough. I think trading Pablo Lopez was good. Good trade both sides, right? So good things to say about him. I got good things to say about Bryan De La Cruz because of when he came back to the majors, right, and the numbers that he put up after that. And then Jazz. I keep saying Chaz, but it's Jazz. Jazz is another super highlight that you can talk about with Miami, and likely they're crowning him the prince basically of Miami and the guy who's going to turn around this offense. But we got to talk about Avisail Garcia and just what a horrendous signing this was. I mean, this stinks of Chris Bryant to Colorado. Like that's what.
Well, this is worse than Chris Bryant in my mind.
It just but it's that kind of signing, right? It's just like, oh, we have to do something, so let's just go out and get this guy.
Yeah, they're doing something was far worse than Colorado's feeling like they have to do something. At least Chris Bryant can hit the baseball. He's got the big name. He'll sell some tickets. No one's coming to see Avisail Garcia to play baseball, especially with the production that he had in 2022.
Okay. So you're paying this guy, he's getting paid $12 million a season, right? And you're paying him for the next couple of years. He comes out in 2022. He has an OPS of 582. He has an on-base percentage of 266 and a slugging percentage of 317. Now, you and me both read the baseball prospectus. there's a very key section in there about Avisail Garcia where they talk about turning his raw power into game power. I like these articles, but sometimes numbers just speak for themselves, and sentences like that be damned. The guy put up a 317 slug. His OPS is horrendous. Like, any team looking to pay this guy any kind of money, I mean, Jesus, arguably this is like, if a guy just came up through their farm system and was doing this, he would be sent back. Like, you don't cut it. He hit the ball on the ground 55.6% of the time. There is nothing to suggest that this man holds any hope, in my opinion, for Miami Marlins fans. It smacks of guy got a big paycheck. He's going to now come in and play for Miami, and Miami fans just have to sit there and watch this waste of money and talent, and it's just across the board for Avisail Garcia's. And I don't even understand, when you look at it, I don't even understand why they saw the potential in the first place, because it's not like he came out and like owned the league in any kind of way.
No, he had one season where he had more than 20 home runs, and he did it in a relatively small sample size within that 2021 season for Milwaukee. But even within that season, the walk rate didn't approach 10%. When you look at the K percentage, it was still north of 20% by a pretty substantial margin. And the on-base percentage was still only 330. So it's not like even though he had a productive season for the Milwaukee Brewers, it wasn't like this guy was a can't-miss MVP candidate on the rise, or that his stock was moving. He was also 30 years old. So the idea that one season could supplant 8 or 9 seasons of mediocrity and being a part-time player, that's what's ludicrous to me. That's where, like, Chris Bryant went out and won a World Series. Chris Bryant was an MVP. Chris Bryant was a guy who went and performed at the highest levels of baseball in the postseason and performed well. Avisail Garcia has never done anything. He had a handful of good games for a Milwaukee Brewers team. I say that a little bit sarcastically, but really 135 games in the course of a career of 1,049 games is a relatively small sample size. And to say that these 29 home runs meant more than 2 home runs in 53 games the year before that, 20 home runs in 125 games the year before that, is ludicrous to me. And I do agree with you. It speaks of desperation. It screamed of having some new decision makers in the room and having a guy like Don Mattingly who needed something to feel like there was a hope and a prayer of Miami being competitive on some level. And then, yeah, I mean, you look at his savant chart, and the guy did pretty much everything at the worst rate that he possibly could. Chased a ton of pitches out of the strike zone, swung through an alarming number of pitches in the strike zone and out of the strike zone, didn't work the count, didn't walk, didn't have good exit velocities. Like, there's nothing at all in my mind to like about Garcia. Don't draft him in fantasy. This guy should never find his way into your lineup in DFS. He sure as hell is not winning any MVPs. He's 300-1. It's kind of just a fun thing for sportsbooks to put his name out there to see if they can make $5 or $10 off someone who is an Avisail Garcia fan for some reason or another.
For some reason. It's his mom, right? I mean, yeah, it's sad. It's sad because there's nothing positive to say about that contract. There's nothing positive to say about his performance. Just sad. So, you know what? I've said my negative piece, and we can move on to the next negative piece, right? Because the next guy is Jorge Soler. Now, listen, Jorge Soler, I kind of understand a little bit why you bring this guy in, right? Clearly a power hitter. He was a power hitter for the Kansas City Royals, and he hit 48 bombs. He played 162 games in 2019. I mean, that was like his highest caliber season, right? 27 years old. You're looking at his fan graphs here, 569 slug. Everything screamed, this guy is the next thing for Kansas City. Kansas City moves off him, right? 26% strikeout percentage, by the way. Not exactly great. So he smacks of your traditional, like, is this guy?
It's a guy who swings hard. He swings
right
through a lot of pitches, but you put up with it because when he does make contact, a fair percentage of those end up over the outfield wall.
100%. So in 2022, what do we see? 72 games, deals with a lot of injuries, right? 13 home runs. We also see a 29% K rate. So, and an on-base percentage of 295, which is just horrendous. You're paying this guy $15 million, and you're just watching it, just the money go away. And listen, it's contracts like these that discourage owners from wanting to spend money. That's why it's important to talk about these two things, because the other owners in this division are very much willing to spend money because they're having success on the contracts that they're and then the checks that they're writing. But Sherman's looking at this and like, why on earth would I greenlight any money going to you guys when I'm watching my two largest investments just put up duds? And therefore, they're not that de-incentivizes. So your entire GM, your entire front office almost just feels deflated because they have to go beg the owner for more money, right?
Yeah.
And,
and you look foolish for it. And like there's a real embarrassment there, which I think you're exactly on point with. The Cleveland Guardians the Indians at the time, they went and signed Michael Bourne and Nick Swisher, and both guys were complete duds. And it felt like we couldn't go to McDonald's and get a player off the dollar menu for the next 5 seasons because of the catastrophe that Michael Bourne and Nick Swisher were. Nick Swisher was so bad in a Cleveland uniform that he actually paid out of his own pocket for a fireworks display one weekend in Cleveland because he wanted to make it up to the fans for sucking so bad. So, yeah,
that's
those
a great
things.
Comp, by the way. Great comp to pull that out of your arsenal. Those are exactly the two
PTSD. It's stuff like that will never leave my brain as a Cleveland fan. So thank you for at least acknowledging that there's some value in this pain that I've endured over the years.
No, but that is a great example to measure that up, right? You had a team that seemed kind of on the rise, new manager at that time. They had just brought Francona in. I mean, it was gonna like turn this thing around. Let's go sign some marquee free agents. We don't really sign marquee free agents. So who's on the free agent market that we can bring in that can get fans a little bit excited, that can kind of usher in our new farm system? And then they went and got Swisher and Bourne. So that's very similar to what we saw, I think, here with Miami, where they had guys that are coming up through the system. Who can we get to fill seats? Oh, well, we got this guy Garcia who's on the free agent market, who's not super expensive, but he's going to be, but we're not spending a lot of money, period, right? So like we can eat this contract of $12 million. We'll bring him in. And you know what? If we get lucky, maybe he'll produce a couple 20 home run seasons and be a serviceable, 5th or 6th in our lineup and, not have a horrendous glove in the outfield. Great. Sign him. Oh, here's Jorge Soler. This guy could hit 48, 50 bombs. This guy, like in a good season, can look like the old Giancarlo Stanton, right? Oh, yeah, definitely. Let's bring you see the postseason he just had? Let's bring him in. Like, it just smacks of that. It doesn't smack like they actually sat down and took any kind of analytical look at what these guys were. They just based off reputations and how do we put fans in the seat, because we went from putting a 1.5 million people in the seats to 800,000, and they fucking panicked. And now here we go. Let's just sign these guys. And now it's an albatross. They're just hanging around the necks of Miami for the next couple of years.
Yeah.
So
and to be fair, like you look at what Soler did in 2021, there are some things to like here, right? He didn't chase a ton of pitches out of the zone. The hard hit rates were there. The thing that I think a lot of these front office executives forget is Jorge Soler did this in a lineup that went to the World Series. He did this in a run scoring environment in the South where it gets real hot in the summertime, and it is a little bit easier to do some impressive things with the bat. And some of these things, irrespective of the weather and everything, like the chase rate and the walk percentage, things like that. Those were things that I think had people looking up on the Jorge Soler train. But I think you're spot on. They looked at the postseason and the guy hits one of the most iconic home runs in World Series history in Houston, or at least in Atlanta Braves history. And yeah, I think they let that weight their decision too much. The really concerning thing for me about Jorge Soler, and I know he battled really legitimate injuries last year. He had pelvic inflammation. He had back spasms, 2 things that will wreak havoc on a hitter. The problem is the back spasms have nothing to do with his swing decisions. So on pitches, deciding whether or not to swing or not to swing at pitches outside of the strike zone, you can see he regressed by 2.4% in this category from 2021 to 2022. When you look at the pitches inside the strike zone, he was being less aggressive on those offerings. That could be tied maybe to a confidence thing or to understanding that he's not at 100% and he knows he's not able to make contact with those pitches at the same level. And that's where the Z contact percentage comes in. So that's in the zone contact percentage, about a 4% regression. And it's hard to sit here and say that he should be persecuted for that because he was hurt. But when you look at this number throughout his career, this is usually a stable number for a lot of guys that have a more consistent bat path, that have more optimism surrounding their bat, more stability on a year-to-year basis. He's fluctuated with this number significantly throughout his career: 82, 78, 74, 80, 83. Like, you can see these numbers on the screen for yourself. This is what's concerning for me, is that even if you get one season of Jorge Soler at his best during his tenure with the Marlins, you don't know when it's going to come. I mean, he's here for 4 years. He might have one season where he hits 35 or 40 home runs, but the likelihood of him doing this, or 3 more years, but the likelihood of him doing this more than once, in my mind, is very, very low. And if he's dealing with injuries, he's getting older, it makes it less and less worth your time, especially if he ends up blocking younger guys who could be getting playing time. Because the other aspect of this is Jorge Soler is not a good defender. And if we go back and we look at even during his best seasons, he was in the 5th percentile on outs above average, which is the gold standard defensive metric. At least it has been for the last few years. 2021 was in the 5th percentile. That kind of stuff is concerning for me. And I think it reeks of exactly what you said, of an organization that felt compelled to do something, and they didn't have any offense, and they thought, if we can get a guy who can hit some home runs, that might be able to keep us afloat some nights. But to be paying the kind of money that they are on a cash-strapped team like the Marlins for 2 guys that had an on-base percentage of sub 300 last year is about as big of a failure as you can get from a front office perspective.
Yeah, so look, he exercised his player option, right? So that's for this year. That's where he's going to make $15 million. 2024, he's under contract, right? $9 million. And then he's an unrestricted free agent at 33 years old to 2025. What value did you get out of Jorge Soler? Because, like you said, even if you get a great season out of him this year, right? So you paid 3 years, $36 million for one good season. Is that
on a team that's not a contender? It's not like he's putting you over the hump. He's also not a guy that you're going to get a lot for if he does have a great first half and someone wants to add them as a platoon option to a contending roster. Because he's so volatile, a team isn't going to part with a top prospect for him at any point. So I agree. There's 2 moves that don't look great when you're trying to build a team back from the ground up. And
right. And then you got Avisail. You're stuck, guys, with Garcia until 2026 when they have a club option at 35 years old. The Marlins have a club option to cancel that contract. So they're stuck with Garcia for a while. Soler, at least, that they could be gone with in a year or 2. But Garcia, you're stuck until that guy's 35. And I find it highly unlikely they even accept that club option. So you're like, yep, all right, that's when our mistake comes to roost. So horrendous. I know that this has been a darker tone on the videos. A lot of our videos have been more hopeful, but
we can't be excited about everybody. There's got to be at least a handful of teams that we don't think are going to have.
Well, it just sucks about Miami, right? Because there are things to be excited about. It's just that they have so much things that it's like a big old anchor. Ironically, being in the state of Florida, right? It's like you have this great ship, you want to put it out to water, and we're just dragging along this anchor at the bottom of the ocean. And it's these bad contracts. It's the lack of faith the fan base has. It's just rough.
But even the optimism that we have, it's all caveated. There's an asterisk next to almost all of it, except for a guy like Sandy. And then we can go look at a guy like Jacob Stallings behind the plate, a guy who looked like he had promise potentially, but now it looks more and more like he had one good season for this team, and there's really not a whole lot of hope for him going forward. And again, in a league where there's going to be a lot more stolen bases, and you're going to need more and more out of catchers than you ever have in the past, offensively and behind the plate. A guy who hit 223 last year, who walked less than 10% of the time, regressed in a number of key metrics, both discipline, power, contact percentage, power metrics. Another guy with a sub 300 on base percentage in over 100 games played last year. This is problematic for the Miami Marlins. There's usually reasons for every fan base to be able to talk themselves into a best case scenario, and there just really isn't with the Miami Marlins. There's so many red flags, from the hitters from the pitching. And another thing too, we talked about Sean Murphy and what a great addition he was for the Atlanta Braves because of what he can do framing pitches, because of his pop time, his ability to control the running game. If Stallings goes out there and plays another 100 games, 25th percentile in pop time to second base last year, 25th percentile in framing, and then you factor it in with all of the blue that you see with his offensive numbers, there's nothing to like here. Nothing at all. And when we talk about building a strong defense up the middle, because that's another thing. Like when you look at teams that could surprise, if you're strong defensively up the middle, good catcher, a good shortstop, a good center fielder, your defense could be anchored. It could be better than anticipated. If you have great base running, that's a thing that often goes overlooked. If you're a really sound fundamental team that doesn't make mistakes as often as other teams do, those are things that can lead a team to surprise a lot of people. The Miami Marlins don't check any of those boxes in my mind.
Nope, not even a little. So why don't we go and talk about the two guys who I think give a little bit of hope for, right, on the offensive side. I mean, they're young, 26 and 25. Both are going to play in the outfield for Miami. Let's talk about Bryan De La Cruz. Let's talk about Jazz. Those are two guys that, and even Jazz is kind of hard to talk about, right? Because he only played 60 games in 2022, but during those
on the cover games, of MLB The Show this year, so
yeah.
It's exciting. Go get yourself a video game with the Miami Marlin on the cover. Commemorate the 2023 season.
Look, horrendous against left-handed pitching, but that's neither here or there. But let's talk about those two pieces because I think that's really where. Because Luis Arias is also, by the way, 25 years old. Just a side note. So
yeah, but the upside with him, like he's a contact guy that will always be a contact guy. He will never morph into anything more than that. A guy like Bryan De La Cruz, I'm glad you brought him up because this is the one guy on this team that I'm the highest on. Pitcher, hitter, doesn't matter to me. This guy is so exciting. What he's able to do with his bat. Some of the red that we see here with the average exit velocity, with the barrel percentage, with the expected stats, mouth-watering. I'm sure if anyone's picked up a sleeper list this year from anywhere from Baseball America, from Walmart, from Amazon, wherever you get your baseball sleeper list from, you Google baseball sleeper list.
Plastered all over all of them.
Yeah, on every single one. And typically when that's the case, there's a little bit of groupthink happening, and it's usually a cause for concern. Not in the case, in my mind, for Bryan De La Cruz. What happened last year was Bryan De La Cruz struggled. He had some holes in his swing, ended up getting demoted in August. He came back for roughly a month at the end of the season and was absolutely sensational. And when I say he was sensational, it wasn't just this guy had a good month of baseball, because that happens. Even the worst players in the league will have a month where they bat 350 or they'll hit 7 or 8 home runs, and it's not sustainable. The reason I think what Bryan De La Cruz did last year is sustainable going into 2023 and beyond is because it was a mechanical adjustment. After the August demotion, he returned and he took this leg kick. He used to have a pretty big leg kick, and maybe you can get a video for these guys and throw it on your Instagram in the coming days. But De La Cruz had a pretty sizable leg kick that messed with his timing more than anything. Didn't mess with his bat path. He's always had a really impressive bat path. He's had one of the lowest standard deviations of launch angle in all of baseball, meaning that it's consistent. The bat path is always coming through at the same angle. It's repeatable, very mechanically sound. When he came back up for that final month of the season, he batted .388. He had an OPS over 1,000, had 6 homers, over 20 RBIs in 94 plate appearances. Really, really good news for Miami Marlins fans. You can see this 23rd percentile K rate. Much improved after he came back with the toe tap, which was a lot less dramatic, helped him with his timing. He struck out only 21.3% of the time. He barreled the ball almost 20% of the time, which is just hard to fathom in any sample size. I mean, that's truly up there with some of the game's elite. The 443 BABIP, I think, is the biggest red flag. That's what everybody's going to look at and say, well, Bryan De La Cruz was just lucky for about a month. And that's why his service level stats look so good. But what we talk about a lot is that all BABIPs are not created equal. If you have a guy who hits the ball on the ground a lot, that's a lower expected batting average than if you hit line drives. If you hit a lot of fly balls, that's a lower expected batting average than if you hit line drives. Bryan De La Cruz came back and had a 32.8 line drive percentage across his final 94 plate appearances. Unsustainable, no question. but it does portend a guy who could probably sustain maybe a 340 or a 350 BABIP in years to come if he continued to hit the ball like that. The other thing that was really encouraging to see after he came back up in August, his O swing percentage, Z swing percentage, O contact percentage, and Z contact percentage all got better after he came back, meaning that he was swinging at fewer pitches outside of the strike zone after he came back. He was being more aggressive on pitches in the strike zone after he came back. And when he was getting pitches inside the strike zone, he was doing more damage with them. So all of this to me screams this is a guy who made a lot of mature adjustments at the plate after his demotion last August. Very, very excited to see what he does over the course of 162 games. Defense needs some work, which is, again, another reason that I'm not super high on Miami as a team. I think he's going to make some defensive blunders, but with the bat, which is pretty much all that matters from a fantasy perspective,
Right.
Bryan De La Cruz should be a guy that you reach for. Absolutely.
Do you see him? I just think when you say reach for him, I just think of all the people in fantasy who's going to take him like in the third round and tell you.
Yeah, don't take him in the third round, but if you can get him at a reasonable reach, definitely go out there and be competitive and draft this guy above where his ADP is currently.
Promoting malpractice there, Commish. But do you think this guy, he's going to be another example of like the Sandy Alcantara contracts? Like, do we see a contract that's like, let's say he lights up April and May? Do you think we see one of those 8-year, like the Lourdes Robert deal, right? Like 8-year, $70-80 million, lock up the young guy, even though he hasn't proved a lot?
No, but more so because of his age in this situation with him already being on the wrong side of 25. I could see a deal where the Marlins commit to him for maybe like 6 seasons and buy out what should be the majority of his prime, and then he can go from there and maybe enter free agency one more time. He's also a guy that I think, because he's proven so little and he's only been productive over such a small sample size, that the Miami Marlins do let this ride out, and they do just sort of see where things go here, because the Miami Marlins, we mentioned, they're sort of in this weird matrix position where they're not really sure where their window is. At some point, they're probably going to have to go through a Philly or a New York or an Atlanta that is actually just a really damn good baseball team. They're going to be in a division that is blocked, unless we're talking about a potential realignment of the divisions if Major League Baseball does expand to 32 teams. Other than that, which I don't think you can count on, the Miami Marlins at some point are just going to have to decide, okay, we're in the same conversation with these other 3 giants in the division. And I think a guy like Bryan De La Cruz, you need to hit on him. He needs to be a guy who is legitimately an all-star pushing MVP candidate at some point before the age of 30. The problem is syncing these timelines with a vision for the franchise of when are we actually going to be a formidable team, because you can have Sandy Alcantara, but he's only going to be there for a few more years, more than likely, before he's either traded or leaves in free agency. Bryan De La Cruz is another guy who I don't think fits into a 5-year plan. I think he's a guy who's really exciting to watch. You want him to perform well, but I don't know if you want to lock him up for 8 years, and I don't know if you necessarily see him being at the podium when you eventually are winning a pennant or hopefully winning a World Series championship. I think this is a guy who ultimately you're going to end up trading at some point. And if you're Miami, like, this really sucks to say, but I don't think Miami is going to be able to realistically compete until probably 2030.
Yeah, I see the guys on this roster, and they're going to try and make a trio out of Arias, De La Cruz, and Jazz. Like, those are the 3 guys that are going to try and make that little trio about to sell tickets. And you're absolutely right. It's hard when you do the strategy of like, we're going to do complete rebuild mode, and therefore friends and family and fans alike hold your breath, and we're going to stink for 4 years. Like, Miami did that in 2017-18. Like, they basically said that to the fan base. Like, everyone hold your breath, because we're going to trade all of our stars for the prospects that are going to turn this into a winning ball club. And here we are in 2022. And now literally Kim Ng's going to say the exact same thing probably in a year from now. Everyone hold your breath. We got to reload. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. We've been holding our breath for 5 years.
But even longer than that, Gio, because when is the last time the Marlins had a winning record in a 162-game season? 2009. So even when this team has been trying to win baseball games, they haven't been able to win. So that's where there's a lack of faith with a fan base, where they keep being told, wait, we're doing all of these things with the best interest of the team in mind. How do you trade Giancarlo Stanton, Marcell Ozuna, JT Realmuto, Christian Yelich. How do you trade all 4 of those guys and make one postseason since then?
Right.
And
really
that was in a 60-game season in which you went 31-29. So it's not like you set the league on fire. This is where there's a disconnect. This is why fans don't show up to the ballpark, aside from the nightlife and the beautiful weather and the beautiful people in South Beach. There is no trust in the organization to put a winning ball club on the field. And the fans that do have a really intelligent grasp of what's happening around baseball and within their division, they understand that they're not going to ever spend money like Steve Cohen or like the Liberty Media Group in Atlanta. And they don't have a Dave Dombrowski who's going to convince an owner to go out there and spend money. You mentioned at the top of the show, the valuation of their franchise has gone down since the current owner took the reins of this organization. There is nothing here that, as a fan of the Miami Marlins, you sit here and say, you know what, we're just one piece away. We're just 2 years away. We trade this one guy, we get a couple of prospects, we hit on 2 of them, and we're right back there. You have a disproportionate amount of pitching to hitting. The hitting that you have swings and misses way too much. You have shown nothing from an analytical perspective to develop better hitting. I'm getting a little animated here, but I wish the Miami Marlins were better. The Miami Marlins being a competitive baseball team, I think, would make the major league product as a whole a lot better. Right. And it sucks to see them perennially in this weird matrix where they're not good enough. They're not bad enough for a number 1 pick. They're not good enough to really contend for a playoff position. And they're in this weird middle ground where it's like nobody really cares about them. They're not good enough to be hated in any regard. They're not bad enough to be pitied. So they just sort of exist.
Yeah.
There's no identity. They're that kid in your class who is in the class, but you don't know their name. You have no feelings towards them, positive or negative. You'll never go out of your way to find out more about this person because they have no impact on your life. The Miami Marlins have no impact on the greater ecosystem of Major League Baseball.
Yeah, they're in purgatory, right? It's equivalent to an NFL team that has pieces around it but no quarterback, right? And you're not bad enough where you're going to be high enough in the draft to go get your QB, and you're not good enough where you're actually going to realistically compete for the playoffs. So, yeah, I agree with you. Miami's got a real tall order. I think all these pieces in our 2025 videos won't be around, and that's fine. Like, I hope that a lot of these good pieces find their way to some solid teams, because I would much rather see Sandy Alcantara in a winning tradition. I would much rather see Arias go compete for a winning ball club, and same thing with Jazz and Bryan De La Cruz are the 2 that will be interesting. I think they could make it through. The classic.
So give me your thoughts on Jazz then. Like, I mean, this is a guy who, frankly, in my opinion, just has some major holes in his game, but a lot of people are in love with him. A lot of people, I mean, he's 70-1 to win MVP. I think that's ridiculous. To me, the fact that I sort of joked about him being on MLB The Show, but he reminds me a little bit of Javi Baez, a guy who fun to watch. He's got a lot of personality. He's got a great Euro step on his home run trot. But what are your thoughts on Jazz? Before I need a break from. I'm getting too heated about the Miami Marlins for a minute, so I can't look at things 100% rational. I'm hoping that you'll say something here to cool me down a little bit. What do you think about Jazz going into 2023?
Listen, I wish I could say something that would, I think, calm you down a little bit. I don't think I will. It's funny because we said 2 negatives that we'll talk about, and then 2.
And somehow we're turning this one into a negative as well. And I apologize for that if you're a Miami Marlins fan, but it's hard for me I will never lie to someone. And when we bring this up, I feel myself just getting pulled by this black hole of negativity that I can't escape, because it's the reality that we live in.
Okay, look, if you're Miami, Jazz came out and had a good. He's 24, okay, He's now going to be 25 years old. He came out and he had a pretty good start of a season for a young player in a team with no hope. Javi Baez is a great comp to Jazz. People love Javi Baez. And the reason I think they love Javi Baez, even though he is a subpar baseball player in my mind, he's exciting. He's fun. He's got a personality. And we talk about culture. I mean, does Jazz need to be the perennial all-star who, represents Miami in their long-standing trek to not win anything in the next decade? Maybe. Like they need Miami fans need something to root for, right? So if Miami fans take solace in the fact that, at 23 years old, he hit 18 bombs for us. He played in 124 games. He came up onto the scene. Did he strike out a lot? Sure. But you know what? He was exciting, and he provided a young bat in a very dark situation. And in 2022, he comes out and he has a pretty good first half. I mean, the guy can't hit left-handed pitching. I mean, he really, really struggled. And when you see
He's
his
horrific against left-handed pitching.
yeah, like when you see his splits, man, it's like
let's pull him up.
It's as if he's
look at
playing
it
a different. He's playing a different sport when he's playing against left-handed pitching, right? But maybe you could say March, April, May, June, like there wasn't enough of a sample size to make a determination if he was going to turn that around. Fine.
No, but let's look at the course of 3 seasons of baseball. K percentage 5% higher against lefties. On base percentage 50 points lower. The slugging percentage south of 4. The OPS is unplayable. Like, this is not a guy who is seriously considered an everyday player in my mind on a much better team.
He's got in 2022 he had a 2.6% walk rate and a 205 on base percentage for against lefties. So
yeah, I mean, and people can see this for themselves, right? Like let's go look at 2022.
Don't torture them. Don't torture them.
No, genuinely. Like, I know this is a very, very small sample size. So again, like he's definitely not this bad against left-handed pitching.
Have mercy.
So like a little bit of caution here. But again, when you're looking at these stats over 3 years, this is not terribly dissimilar to what he's done. The power goes way down, the contact goes way down, and the contact really isn't that great against right-handed pitching as well. So fortunately for him, you see a lot more right-handed pitching than you do left-handed pitching throughout the course of an MLB season. But Jazz Chisholm is far from a complete baseball player. And when you talk about building around a guy as part, like, they consider him undeniably, I think, a centerpiece of this roster. One, you don't move the centerpiece of your roster to a new position. You move other people around him.
That was going to be the next question. And by the way, now go play center field.
Yeah, so like
to back that up.
Yeah, so one, I think that's ridiculous that you're asking someone that is allegedly the face of your franchise to go play center field, a position where he doesn't really have the arm to do that. The reason he played second base is because he doesn't have great arm strength. I know he has Avisail Garcia and Bryan De La Cruz or Soler that have good arms in the outfield, but to put him in center, I mean, my God, like in a season where Major League Baseball is going to have more people in scoring position than we've seen in probably a decade because of the bigger bases, because of the more emphasis on stolen bases, there's going to be a lot more guys at second base this season that are going to score on singles hit directly to the outfield if they're hit to center in Miami, because Jazz has not thrown anybody out. That's problematic. And then you have a guy who is actually a tremendous liability against left-handed pitching, who you see semi-frequently. I mean, maybe once a week over the course of 25, 30 weeks of an MLB season. That's a decent amount of missed games or games where he's not particularly reliable. And God forbid he goes into a slump against right-handed pitching. Now you have a centerpiece that is actually just a pretty average baseball player with major holes and deficiencies, both with the glove and at the plate.
So, what I was just thinking to myself, who they got, who they traded away for Jazz, right? Why they need this trade to work? Do you know who they got for him? Like, who they traded to get Jazz from Arizona?
I'm waiting for you to tell me this.
Zach Gallen. Remember? Gallen was playing for Miami. Again, another.
I do remember. Yeah, now that you bring this up, I do remember that they had
another stud in their rotation when he was in Miami, by the way. Like, it wasn't like Gallen was struggling and they traded away Jazz. Like, they traded Gallen to get Jazz. They need Jazz to work. And I was just looking at this roster, looking at my notes. The Luis Arias trade, right? And you go out and you get, that smacks of. I mean, I I think about it more now, and it smacks of the Avisail Garcia and Jorge Soler thinking, in my opinion, more than it does the let's build a young core of offensive pieces. Like, are you telling me you couldn't get Pablo Lopez to the Yankees and get like one of their actual, like Oswaldo Cabrera, like an actual top prospect for a Pablo Lopez, a ready major league pitcher who is
I don't
actually
think
doing
you could.
very well?
I actually don't think you
I
could for
think
Pablo
you could.
Lopez.
I think that there are plenty of teams that they could have shopped that out because Luis Arias is not a bad piece. Like that actually was a good take back for trading a guy like Pablo Lopez. And I think there are other teams that you probably could have shopped Pablo around. And Arias smacks of our timetable is 10 years from now. Let's go get a guy who can put people in the seats. That's just not how you win. That's not how you establish a winning tradition.
Yeah, but I think we
seeing it.
disagree here. I think we'll disagree a little bit because one, I don't think Luis Arias is selling any tickets. I think if anything, people are a little bit dispirited with the fact that
Promoting him that way, though. I mean, they're
I
promoting
understand
him
that,
in a
but I
way.
mean, but the receptivity of you're trading Pablo Lopez, who has been branded as part of the Miami organization as a guy that they're grooming alongside of Sandy Alcantara, who's Pablo Lopez has had ace-like stretches or spurts the last couple of seasons, and there was tremendous flaws. So I don't think it's a bad thing by Miami whatsoever to get rid of him. But I guess we're not so as far apart as I guess I thought when I started this point. But Arise is a guy who Miami couldn't make contact at all last year. The entire lineup was embarrassingly bad when it came to contact percentage. So you go get a guy that you just know won't strike out, and you have Joey Wendell in the lineup, and you have Gene Segura who you went out as well and acquired him. So I think Miami's trying to make more contact this year just to give themselves a fighting chance. If you put the ball in play, maybe you get a bad hop. Maybe we'll see Lone Depot Park have a bunch of ruts in the infield this year, and they'll be trying to take advantage of that, and that'll be some sick version of home field advantage that Miami tries to implement. But they're trying to do something to just not lose 100 games, which I don't know. I don't know if that's the best approach. No, I agree with that. That's why I said, like, I thought we were further apart, and then I think I understood more of what you were getting at with Arise, and I'm with you. Like Miami they shouldn't try to win 80 games. Miami should either fully commit to their young pitching core and a timetable that's 7 years down the road, or they should go spend a lot of money right now and try to get one of these wild card spots because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a lot of money because even a guy like Jazz, and like we're sitting here too, and I promise it'll be the last thing I pick at him for, but this is concerning that the guy's been in the major leagues now for a few seasons, and he's regressed in some of these zone contact areas that we keep telling you, like modern scouting places a lot of emphasis on this. Swinging strike rate is just the easiest way to explain it is how often is a guy swinging and then swinging and missing through the pitch that he's trying to hit. 9.5%, okay. 12.5%, worrisome, especially with there being such a stark difference here. 13.7% continues to go in the wrong direction here. More concerning is the fact that this is happening, or at least appears to be happening, primarily on pitches within the strike zone. So he's getting pitches to hit that he's missing, which is incredibly problematic. Going from 91.4%, and again, this was a small-ish sample size when he first came up in 21 games here, but the fact remains that it's still a major regression from where he was, even if this wasn't going to be sustainable for 162 games. The fact that he was even at 81% the year before that and then further regressed, that is something for me. Like, Jazz isn't ascending towards stardom. He's not ascending towards potentially contending for individual accolades. This is a guy that is potentially getting worse. And he's a cornerstone of a team that I'm done. I'm done picking at the Marlins. I'm done. I'm done with this team. I like the pitching. There are some guys that I'm really excited to watch throw the baseball for them. The offense is pathetic.
You said something too about could you throw money at this team and could you make it into a contender again? And I don't think so. I don't think you convince like free agents. I was just looking up like, who are going to be the free agents in like 2024? Who are going to be the free agents in 2025? I think even if they had like a Jeff Bezos kind of guy come in, and I only use Jeff Bezos in terms of like the dollar amount that he has available, or Cohen, who's probably just more baseball oriented.
Just a hedge fund guy.
Yeah,
Much
I
money.
mean, even if you had a guy who just wanted to have a baseball team to play around with because he has so much money, he doesn't know what to do with himself. Who do you go and get that wants to sign with Miami? Honestly, like why would I submit myself to that? Like you have to have something. And again, if building a culture, there's just no one that's going to be out there in the market that is really going to build a culture if you're going to spend the money. Like you're not going to get Shohei Ohtani. You're not, and maybe they could have done it like at the Juan Soto trade. You know how the Padres gave away that whole deal for him. I'm sure it'll be part of your monologue against the Washington Nationals for the Juan Soto trade.
Oh yeah, I mean terrible trade, but that'll be a different video.
Like what we talked about with the pitchers that are on this roster, Miami could have put together an offer for Juan Soto that would have blown most people out of the water and still would have had a wealth of pitching at the end of that deal, right? So like they have the pitching pieces to go out, but I don't think any of those players are around anymore. Like I can't think of a player of that caliber. Like because if you do bring in like a Juan Soto, then all of a sudden the culture kind of maybe shifts. 23-year-old guy. That's our future. We sign him to a massive extension. We get him to buy. We have him for 2 years, even if he doesn't want to re-sign with Miami, right? So like, but there's no guy out there right now that's like that. Like, who's up for that? And it's Ohtani, but no way does Ohtani go to Miami. No way would you trade for that. So it's like, there's no hope, in my opinion, for this franchise. You're gonna stick in purgatory for a little bit, or their new general manager, Kim Ng, is going to go out and say to the fans and have to sell us yet again to the fan base of, all right, we're going to move all the good guys and we're going to start from scratch and we're going to lose 110 games and we're going to try to get high draft picks and we're going to hit on those draft picks and we're going to develop our young talent and we're going to put all these younger pitchers, we're going to pick 2 or 3 of them and keep them in the arbitration process and have them cheap for a couple of years, pay them at the end to be our savvy veterans, our Max Frieds at 29 years old, and we're going to set ourselves up to be Atlanta in 2030. You know what I mean? Like that's.
Yeah, but the problem is that the pitching is too good for them to lose 100 games. Last year they had no offense and they still won almost 80 games. Like it's the reality of where Miami is they're too good at developing pitchers and acquiring pitchers and then bringing them in and making them better. They're too good at that to lose 100 games.
They need to blow it up.
They're woefully deficient at developing offensive talent, so they're nowhere near being able to win 100 games. So they can't get the high-end prospects that they need. They can't, there's no rapid ascension for this organization. And then, as we mentioned with the payroll at the top, they're consistently bottom third in the league in payroll. And even if they wanted to spend more money, after seeing the debacle that happened when they had Hanley and Jose Ramirez and all of those guys in the early 2010s, I agree with you. Who do you convince to come here? And if you trade for someone, how do you get them to re-sign? Right? I think they might have had the Juan Soto conversations. I mean, we never saw them linked in the Jeff Passan comments or the Bob Nightingale comments, but you have to imagine that Miami was a team that could have called on Juan Soto and said, what will it take? But then whatever conversations transpired of Juan Soto maybe just not wanting to commit to that team long-term the way that he wanted to commit to San Diego. And that's all purely speculation. Of course, we don't have those types of sources, but all of it boils down to Miami Marlins 2023. I think we've firmly established that they are not as good as the top 3 teams in their division. And we've also firmly established that they're nowhere near as bad as the worst team in their division.
Yes.
But what does that mean for their win total? Over under 76.5 wins. It's at 75.5 at a few different books. Where do you have them finishing this season record-wise?
Under. I have them like 70, 72 wins. I don't see much hope. I think the other teams in the division are going to beat them up when they play. I don't think that their offense is good enough to sustain a series, right? So it's like, sure, they throw Sandy out in the first game and maybe you can win, but I think after that, there's no hope for their bullpen. Dark days ahead for Miami. I think much to do about nothing. About 70-72 win ball club.
Honorable mention before I give you my prediction. John Birdie, league leading 41 stolen bases last year at the age of 32. But he can't make any solid contact to save his life. So even though there's some rule changes that make stealing bases easier, there are no rule changes that make getting on base easier.
Yeah, sippity doo that day.
So I honorable mention for him. He won't even be in the starting lineup most days for Miami, which says a lot about his bat relative to the bats that we just admonished for the last 25 minutes. I'm also going under here. The Miami Marlins have a wealth of pitching, but they have a lot of question marks behind Sandy Alcantara. I like Johnny Cueto coming in as a mentor figure, but he's old. There's been durability concerns with him. We go look at Luzardo. We go look at Cabrera, even guys like Braxton Garrett and Trevor Rogers, who I'm high on long term. There's question marks of what their output is going to be in 2023. The bullpen we went over in depth of. There's not a lot of guys in there that are truly high leverage late inning relievers. That's not a knock on the organization. They're just that's an intent thing. They understand that they're not going to contend for a postseason spot. They understand that they're facing an uphill battle to even finish at 500. And the offense, some of these guys that Miami is undoubtedly anticipating a bounce back year from or hoping for a bounce back year from, Avisail Garcia, Jorge Soler, it's most likely not in the cards for them. And they can add all the high contact guys in the world they want with Joey Wendell and Gene Segura and Luis Ariz and Garrett Cooper. Like that, there's a very clear organizational philosophy shift here of we want to make more contact. That's why you go get Segura. That's why you make the changes that you make with Joey Wendell and go trade Pablo Lopez for Luis Ariz. So I don't think their decision making is terrible, but they lack probably a single truly high upside offensive talent that's proven. And I think there's two guys that have some hope with Bryan De La Cruz and Jazz Chisholm, but Bryan De La Cruz did it for a month. And I think as much as I like Bryan De La Cruz, that's not a lot to go off of. And there's not a lot of foundation there to build from. And Jazz Chisholm, maybe I was too hard on, but there's a lot of flaws in his game as well. So those things are all knocks. And then when you look at the defense, they're weak at a number of different positions, especially at catcher. And I know you've talked about this at length. In a year where controlling the running game was going to be more important than it ever has been, not having the ability to have plus defense at that position is definitely a problem. So for me, the Miami Marlins, we're going under 76.5 wins, and I honestly don't think it's going to be that much of a sweat. I know that we don't play our division opponents 20 times each anymore with the new schedule, but they still got to play them more than they play the rest of the league, and having even a decent number of games against Atlanta, against the Mets, and against Philadelphia, that's going to be rough. And then they're not better than a lot of the other teams that they're going to go play, the Arizona Diamondbacks, the Colorado Rockies, even going and playing the Central Division of the American League this year. How much better is this team than the Detroit Tigers and the Kansas City Royals that at least have some hope on the roster, that have some exciting prospects? Yeah. So yeah, under 76.5 wins for me. Any closing thoughts from you before we get out of here?
Only that I will look to this team to back up my hunch. Well, hunch, but also backed up by stats and what I think is actually going to happen in the NL East of the three-man race of Phillies, Mets, and Atlanta, all doing very well this season. I think most competitive division in baseball. So Miami is a team that's going to play into that narrative because I think they'll give a little bit of a run of the money. Like there will be a couple of games where those starting pitchers that we talked about will shine, right? And I think the division could rest on who has better success against the hard games of Sandy Alcantara and some of these young guys who pitch for Miami. So look for Miami maybe to decide the division in that way. And that's all.
That is the worst compliment that you could give to the Miami Marlins. You have an opportunity to play spoiler against teams that will be playing games that actually matter for them.
That's what
we're ending on. That is what we're ending on. Miami fans, if you found the content offensive, please don't unsubscribe. If you are deeply troubled by the information that we gave to you in this video, please do not stop watching the other videos. We greatly appreciate your support, and we look forward to having you back, man. Like the Marlins are not doomed forever, but it's a rough spot to be in, no doubt.
Yeah, we love you, Miami fans. We feel for you in every kind of way. I really do. But
Genuinely. Like as a Cleveland
not a
fan,
good team.
as a Cleveland fan, like I understand the pitfalls of not having the money to spend, of not being able to attract marquee free agents. There's some things that the organization is doing right from an analytical perspective on the pitching side of things. Hopefully they get some staff in there that can help on the offensive side of things. But man, appreciate you joining again. I'm excited to see where you're at next time we bring you on and what your background looks like. But yeah, man, if you guys haven't checked out Gio yet, a lot of great content over on Instagram at NextGenGio. He's going to be doing a lot of stuff on YouTube with us this season. He's also, if you see any of the videos that I post to Twitter, he's the guy behind that. So greatly appreciate you joining. Appreciate all the work that you do behind the scenes as well. It's not easy having all this wealth of information available, and guys like Gio and some of the other guys that I work with, we exchange a lot of information, we exchange a lot of thoughts. So definitely go support their work, and yeah, man, we'll keep bringing the content. But until next time, appreciate everyone who tuned in. Go check out the NBA content that we post every day with the player props. Go check out the rest of the MLB stuff that we're doing, all 30 teams in 30 days. Can't wait for opening day. See you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.